What a lovely exhibition you have ahead of you if you haven't seen it yet. It's remarkable in that, and unique, I think, in that it links the Impressionist paintings with those old masters that the Impressionists studied in the Louvre, as Renoir did. And in fact, I will show you a link to one particular painting that generated this. His, I think it's his masterpiece. But here, that painting will become very familiar to you, and the actors in it, as we go along today. It has been in the United States for 84 years at the Phillips Collection in Washington, where it has served as a symbol of France and French culture, as evocative, in my mind, and triumphant an image as that other emissary of France, La Statue, come on, de la Liberté, oui. Besides being the central masterpiece of the art movement that changed the look of art forever. The painting depicts joyous friendship, the appreciation of beauty, verve, the intoxication with life, that is to say, the essence of the French soul. Some part of me came alive the first time I saw this painting. I knew immediately I wanted to write a novel about it, but I didn't quite know how at that time. It had to rest in my thought for several years while I worked on The Forest Lover and Life Studies. But I think what came alive is that I glimpsed more than the aesthetics of another culture. I glimpsed a range of cultural attitudes. And I sensed that studying this painting was bound to enrich my life because it suggests a supplement d'âme, something more in the soul, another region, ultimately more important than what can be quantified. And it has to do with time. The meal is over, yet they are lingering. To me, that's the French art de vivre. Now, what is this painting about? Yes, 14 people, Renoir's friends, real people, by the way, 1880. But it's also about the tantalizing riches of the senses. It invokes a variety of sensuous experience beyond the visual. There's a breeze. How do I know that? You know, we're a small group. You can just shout it out. The awning is, the scallops are flipping around, you know. And what's on the river? Yeah, but what kind of boats? Sailboats, which means there has to be enough of a breeze to have those boats go out. And what other senses do we have? The fruit on the table that graces the eyes, yes. But it also, the pears are juicy, and we feel that. We sense the last taste of wine in the glass, the crunchiness of the bread. We see that one model's fingers is deep into a dog's fur, so that's the sense of touch or the feeling. Another model is leaning out over that railing, feeling the sun on her back, luxuriating in that warmth. So to me, they are sucking pleasure out of life, prizing the moment, the play of colors surrounding them, noticing the look in someone's eyes, probably flirtatious, and engaging in spirited exchange. I envy their capacity to fill themselves with this pleasure, to grasp that fleeting present and hold it for a moment, as you might hold a small bird for a moment before letting it go. Ultimately, that painting asks us to stop and look and listen and taste and feel and ultimately appreciate. At its finest moments, that's what art can do for us, if we let it work. And the novel is my way of disseminating that seductive spirit and those sensibilities. In that glorious kind of swirling world that I lived in for 3 years while I worked on it, that joie de vivre became my joie de travail as I worked. And that brought me close to the models and to Renoir, that poet of joy rendered in color. The novel operates on 4 levels, and I'll just list them now and we'll go back to some of them. And one is, of course, the painting and Renoir, the process. Another is the models, their identities and their lives. And the third is what those lives tell us about Paris at the time, 1880, a time when even Parisians called that period la vie moderne. And fourth level would be what's happening in the art scene, both within the Impressionist group, which was sadly feeling the strains of people going in different directions, and the break from the traditional way of judging art through the government-sponsored salon once a year in April, which was honored only those paintings that really were painted in the traditions taught at the Académie des Beaux-Arts. So those are the 4 levels. Let's get back to this painting and this level. It's really a miracle that this painting exists, because one has to consider the difficulties of execution. Getting 14 people out to Chatou. I should say that Chatou is an island in the Seine, about 20 or 25 minutes by train west of Paris, and then maybe a less than a quarter-mile walk. But you see, he only had 2 months to do this. From the time he started, late July, 8 Sundays, because most of these people were working people, and he could only really get them out on Sundays. But why only 2 months? Because in 2 months, the good light on the Seine would be gone by 4 o'clock or so. The other things that make this a miracle, besides this race against time, was how was he to convey the perspective, anchor that terrace to a building, and convey that there's a river below them. So this was quite the challenge for him. Now, I'm going to read you the opening of the book, in which he gets the idea for the painting and what's happening in his life at the time. And the first chapter is called La Vie Moderne. 20 July 1880. He rode the awkward steam cycle along the ridge to catch the glimpses of the domes and spires of Paris to the east, and then turned west and careened headlong down the long, steep hill toward Bougival and the Seine. With his right elbow cast in plaster, he could barely reach the handlebar, but he had to get to the river. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Idleness had been itching him worse than the maddening tickle under his arm, under the cast. Only painting would be absorbent enough to relieve them both. Steam hissed out of the engine, but it built up inside of him. He reached down to open the throttle wider. The soft morning light would be flattened to a glare by the time he got there if he didn't let her go all out. The piston beat faster in the cylinder until it became a whir of sound. The poplars and chestnuts along the road, a blur of greens. The blooming genêts, a blaze of yellow, with the blue-green sweep of the river coming closer and closer. A painting. He was plunging into a painting. Down and down he plunged. At the base of the hill, he checked behind him to see that his folding easel, canvas, and wooden color box were still strapped on. The three-wheeled cycle took the humped bridge at Bougival fine, but the coarse sand on the narrow connected islands made the front wheel wobble. All types of canoes, rowing yawls, sailboats, and racing sculls, tied to posts along the riverbank, produced inverted images quivering in the lazy current, deliciously paintable, but not today. Today, they were empty of life. On Sundays, though, every laundress with her chapped red arms, every shopgirl, mail clerk, butcher, and banker, Parisians of all classes, took their leisure either on the Seine or in it or along its grassy slopes. La Grenouillère, the frog pond, one of the many rustic ganguettes along the river that provided food, music, and dancing, had a lonely air about it now compared to Sundays. Then pleasure-loving Parisians threw off their city restraints and filled the floating cafe, shouted from the rented rowboats, splashed each other in the shallow eddies, picnicked along the bank, drank and danced on the anchored barge the way he and Claude Monet had painted it a decade ago. They had slapped each other on the back the day they had discovered that juxtaposed patches of contrasting color could show the movement of sunlit water. What he would give for another day like that one, for that thrill of breaking new ground. In the distance, a catboat sailing toward him looked like the Iris, one of Gustave's boats. Yes, it was. He stood up and lost his balance. The front wheel jerked sideways the moment he hailed him, and the cycle tipped and crashed onto its side. His right hip and shoulder struck sand and gravel, his hand and elbow in the cast taking the fall, his cheek taking the bounce. The broken smokestack landed on his left leg. His right leg was trapped under one rear wheel, while the other rear wheel spun with a tick, tick, tick. Boiling water splashed and oil leaked onto his pant leg. He struggled to disentangle himself before getting burned. Jesu Christ, he would destroy himself if he didn't start painting soon. He spit out sand and lay trembling in a cloud of steam, trying to figure out what had happened and watching the glints of light riding in the water. How different the colors from this low angle. The contrast between tips of ripples and valleys between them, more pronounced now. A deeper forest green for the furrows, with shifting patches of yellow-green and ochre on the humps, and the silver highlights, more transparent than he'd ever seen them. My God, to give that to the world. So he gathers up his things. Is it possible to get just a little more light, not necessarily on me, but it's a little disconcerting not to be able to see your faces. That's good enough. That's fine. Thank you. So he gathered up his things and left the three-wheeled steam cycle there and went on the string of islands to La Maison Fournaise, one of these gangettes that had music and food and rented boats. And when he got there to this arbor, the daughter of the restaurant owner, Alphonsine Fornez, saw him, and his face was all bloody and had grit in it. This is what he looked like. That's a self-portrait 5 years earlier. And she asked him, what were you doing? Where were you going? I was coming here. I was looking for a new painting motif. And she says, come upstairs. So she takes him up there to that terrace, the balcony, flings open her arms and says, paint from here. See what you can see? Paint from here. He was more than amused. He'd been telling himself the same thing ever since Fornez had built the terrace. But he'd always postponed the idea. The perspective would be too tricky. He hadn't known how to convey the sense that the terrace was part of a building if he were standing on it and wasn't floating in the sky. Someday, he murmured. Why not now? She asked. He didn't want to admit that he didn't know how. For now, I'm obliged to paint portraits of overbred society women in their fussy parlors. It pays. This would be a painting just for me. It might not pay a bean. But what it offered him! Below the terrace, a dozen rowing skiffs made graceful repeated shapes in the water, and a string of sailboats tied bow to stern formed a caravan from the slanted dock to the floating boat garage. Upriver, the smokestack of a carriage factory cast an ochre reflection and belched charcoal-colored smoke. Claude Monet would position a sail in front of it. Gustave Caillebotte would ignore the bank and paint from the odd perspective of the needle nose of a racing scull, with rowers pulling at their oars. Pissarro, that old communard, he'd make the smokestack central to the painting, symbol of the proletariat. And what would he do? Another riverscape with Parisians in boats, a mix of people eating and drinking, dancing. He envisioned his friends gathered around the tables after a delicious lunch, flushed with pleasure, showing what happens here every Sunday. Leisure, la vie moderne. But how? Impressionist or traditional? It was all tied up with that other question, whether to withdraw completely from the Impressionist circle, continue to submit to the academic salon and betray his friends, or to return to the Impressionist group that he helped to form. He didn't want the characteristic broken strokes of Impressionism to dictate his style in everything, particularly figures. Was he an Impressionist at all? If he deserted the cause and painted in a more classical style, what would happen to the friendships that had kept them going? Who was he really betraying by turning out one society portrait after another? The group? Himself? Both? So upstairs comes the owner of the restaurant, Alphonsine's father, Alphonse Fornez. And I have to say that this was a gathering place of writers and artists and journalists and actors and singers and composers. Bizet lived just downriver a little bit. So this man, Alphonse Fornez, knew them all and was very attuned to the art world. And he gives Renoir a review in a journal written by Émile Zola, the novelist. And I'll read it only in part. If one is too easily contented If one sells sketches that are hardly dry, one loses the taste for works based on long and thoughtful preparation. The real misfortune is that no artist among the Impressionists has achieved powerfully and definitely the new formula, which, scattered through their works, they all offer in glimpses. Formula! Renoir shouted. Art has no formula. If it did, any Montmartre peddler would be painting pictures. He smacked the table with his palm. He's forgotten my ball au moulin de la galette. 6 months' work and 2 preliminary oil studies. You can't lay down 30 heads on a canvas and make it look like a spontaneous moment without long and thoughtful preparation. No, I guess not, Fornes said. Does he think France has turned Protestant, valuing a work by how much the painter sweats in creating it? This was souring a beautiful day. The man of genius has not yet arisen, the review said. We seek in vain a masterpiece. Despite the struggle, all of the Impressionists remain inferior to their self-appointed tasks. A punch in the stomach. He tossed the magazine onto the table. I thought Emile was our friend. Maybe he still is, Fornes said. Maybe he's just throwing down the gauntlet. So Renoir is thinking here of Bal au Moulin de la Galette, his painting of the open-air dance hall in Montmartre, the tinny music, dust rising from dancing feet, the swirl of muslin dresses, the clink of glasses touching, the lively taste of piccolo from the neighborhood vineyard, the fragrance of iris being ground in a windmill for the perfumers of Paris, the breeze lifting a woman's hair to reveal a graceful neck, dappled light filtered through acacias caressing a cheek, being in love. Margot, yes, all of it pulsing again. Encore and encore. What Zola wanted was just what he needed to do. La vie moderne at the Ile de Chateau, as Moulin had been la vie moderne at Montmartre, and encore to Moulin. But this had to surpass Moulin. If he wasn't going to exhibit with the Impressionists again, he could at least support them by answering Zola's charge with a painting designed to astonish. Figures, landscape, genre subject, all in one. Throw in a still life too. Not just a few figures, a dozen or more. Every figure, every feature, a small painting in and of itself. The genius has not yet arisen? Zoot! Zola will eat his words. So, off he goes to the Louvre. Well, the reason I have him go there is that, he was familiar with the Louvre from childhood. You know the shape of the Louvre? It has arms that come out around a big open courtyard. That used to be slum dwellings. And that's where he lived when he was a little kid. His mother was a dressmaker. His father was a tailor. There are several other children. He was apprenticed at age 13 to a China painter to a ceramist workshop. And he began to paint in the Louvre. Now, this is why this next painting, I'll show it to you now, is connected with the exhibition that links Impressionist paintings with the old masters. This is Paolo Veronese, The Marriage Feast at Cana. And it's one of his favorites. He also loved Watteau and Ingres. But With this, he took a look at one of the angles of the table, this left side, your left side. And when you see another of the slides of the painting, you'll see that he used that same angle. He may have also thought of a painting he did 13 years earlier, the Inn of Mother Anthony, the core group of early Impressionists who had met each other at the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, where they were in a painting workshop put forth by Glare, was this group was dissatisfied with what they were getting, dissatisfied with a strict mandate of what to paint and how to paint it. And so they took Courbet's advice and went outdoors and painted in the Fontainebleau forest, and this inn was nearby in the little village of Marly. And you'll see, this fellow is Monet, the young Monet. This is Lecoeur, and this is Alfred Sisley, the Englishman. All right, so let's go back to the painting. You see the angle of the table? Now, I suppose you want to know who these people are, right? You see, it's when I began to discover who they were that I really wanted to write a novel. Because, as I said, they were all real. But I found that their lives and their occupations reflected the issues of the time, the attitudes of the time, the verve of the time, and even the new institutions of the time. So we'll start down here. With this fellow, Gustave Caillebotte, a painter. You may know. Well, I'll show you his paintings in a minute. He tried to keep that Impressionist group together when they were splitting apart. Gustave's father earned a fortune selling woolen cloth to the French government for the soldiers that were going off to fight in the Franco-Prussian War, which happened 10 years earlier, but was such a traumatic loss for France that now, 10 years later, they were just beginning to get over it emotionally and economically. Gustave used that fortune to buy up Impressionist paintings. I think he bought 87 of them, and he wheeled them to the Louvre to be displayed first for 20 years in the Jardin de Luxembourg, where newer art was on display. And he set up Renoir as his executor. And after he died, I'm just giving you some background now. Renoir had a dickens of a time getting those 87 paintings to be accepted by the Louvre. Not paid for, just accepted as a gift. And ultimately, I think only about 37 were accepted. But those 37 eventually were on display at the Jeu de Paume and then became the basis for the Musée d'Orsay. So if you've been to the Musée d'Orsay, that's the man who started that collection. Our man Gustave. He was the one in the sailboat that Renoir hailed and tipped over on his steam cycle. He was a boat builder, boat designer. I read his boating record, and he won practically everything he ever entered. He had 10 boats. And I also read his bank account, and he paid the rent for many, many years for Pissarro and Monet, and sometimes for Renoir. So he's a very important man in the Impressionist circle. Now I'll go a little faster. This gal, Angèle Legault, started life as a poor flower seller, selling flowers in Montmartre and on Pont Neuf. And she reveals how how she did this and how she was kind of in the clutches of a flower broker. And eventually she had a natural singing voice, and eventually she sang opera, light opera. She played the role of Venus in Orpheus and the Underworld. This fellow, Antonio Maggiolo, an Italian journalist of comic escapades. This one, trying to look down her dress. This gal, Jeanne Samaret, with the gloves on. Actress in the Comédie Française. I went to the archives of the Comédie Française to find out what roles she played. She played the maids, serving maids in Molière's plays. And so she shared the stage with Sarah Bernhardt many times. And she was the darling of Paris, and she probably stole the show when it was her scene to say anything. So, also former lover of Renoir. I better go faster. Paul Lot, right there, looking at her closely. Wild man Paul Lot escaped from a prison camp in the Franco-Prussian War 3 times. And one time was Christmas Eve, and so he felt so exuberant being liberated that he went to a beer garden on Christmas Eve. And in the morning they found him there passed out drunk and took him back to prison. So that's how his life went. And this fellow was trying to always keep him in line. Pierre Lestringuez, a member of the Ministry of the Interior, a man interested in the occult. Here, Charles de Fruzy, Russian-born son of a banker, self-taught art historian, collector, editor of the Gazette des Beaux-Arts. His secretary, Jules Laforgue, avant-garde poet whose work influenced T.S. Eliot, Yeats, and Pound. These were no mean people here, you know. These were, and to have them all there at once, pretty amazing. And this gal, Ellen Andre, often modeled for Degas, was a mime in the Folies Bergère. So now I'll just take this half and ask you who these people are. Okay, see what you remember. Gustave Caillebotte, Angèle, Antonio, Jeanne Samaret, Paul Lot, Wildman, Pierre Lestringuez, Charles de Fruzy, the poet, Jules, and you're doing well, Ellen, the mime. And if you forget these, you can just go on my website. Because I have a page called Models, and it gives circles with their face in it and their identification, and a little passage that gives their personality. So now we're going to have some paintings by Caillebotte. This is called Parasoise. If you're ever in Milwaukee, at the Milwaukee Arts Center, you can see this, and you can dive right into that water. It is that real. It's an enormous painting. These boats called Parasoise are a figure in the novel because this is a boating party, and there are races. You may know Caillebotte better for this. Paris Street, Rainy Day. He's known for those plunging perspectives. All right, now back to Angèle, the flower seller. This is another painting of her by Renoir. And when she was acting in her opera roles, that's what she looked like. This is Ellen Andre, the mime. And notice what she's drinking. She's drinking. And what was she doing in the painting? She's right smack in the middle of it. Did any of you see Amélie? That's the figure that artist couldn't get right. But she's drinking you'll see it again when the Luncheon painting comes up. And another painting. And what is she doing here? But it's the same model, but different artists. Who painted this? Degas. So you have different sensibilities, different views of La Vie Moderne. And so you can know from those paintings that Degas and Renoir are going to lock heads at some point in this novel. And this is what Ellen looked like. And the actress, Jeanne Samare, this is in her dressing room that she decorated with fans. Renoir painted her frequently. She didn't like this one, though, because she thought the impressionist stroke on her skin made her arm look like a fish. So she dumped him. And that's, Renoir wanted that so much to be. It was in the salon, but it was poorly hung. It was not in the place of honor. A portrait of Sarah Bernhardt was in the place of honor that year. And this is what Jeanne Samare looked like. Okay, on to the other half of the painting. The woman leaning on the railing is Alphonsine Fornez, daughter of the restaurant owner. She and her husband lived in Paris during the Franco-Prussian War. Her husband was in the war and died of disease in a prison camp. I featured her as the point of view character in 10 chapters because she gave me such possibilities. I mean, she was always there in the painting scenes on the terrace, and yet reflections from her past allowed me to show just what Paris went through in that horrible siege of Paris. And I had her be faced with a moral question as to whether she would follow her Catholic upbringing of loving her neighbor as herself. Well, how does this jibe with politics if your neighbor is Prussia? So she just allowed me to do so much with her character. Now, the man in the derby, also involved in the Franco-Prussian War, he's the Baron Raoul Barbier, captain of the cavalry in 3 wars, injured in 2, honored by France with the post of mayor of Saigon, lover of yacht racing, he had a couple, horse racing, and women. And the big man is Alphonsine's brother, Alphonse. So now you have a father and a son with the same name. And to clarify that, I always call the father by his last name, Fornez. But Alphonse here was a river jouster in the fêtes nautiques, these games that occur in the novel, where you have to be big and burly because you're holding a 10-foot lance on a platform of a boat rowed by 8 rowers and another boat equipped likewise with your opponent, and they go at each other just like the medieval tournaments and try to knock the other one off. The woman holding the dog is Aline Cherigot. Her father owned a vineyard in Champagne and abandoned the family, and so the mother and daughter came to Paris to work as seamstresses. But the father finally turned up, can you believe this, in North Dakota. And then from there moved across the border to Canada. Beats me. Now, if you know anything more about this character, during the Q&A, please do not reveal it. I want the novel to reveal it. All right, so we have 2 more paintings. The first is of Alphonsine, who's leaning on the railing there. And now Renoir paints her again by the railing. That railing and the bridge behind her, which brought the Parisians out from a railroad bridge from Paris, were features in her life. And so it's very fitting that he painted her there. He painted her more than a dozen times. And this is Aline Cherigot, the son of the vineyard daughter. And she is the one standing there holding up her dress coyly. All right, now where did he get these models? Well, from the three milieus that the novel operates. From the river world, from Montmartre, where he got Angèle and Aline, and from the more well-off world of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where this woman, Madame Charpentier, had a salon once a week, attended by artists and writers and politicians and performers. And that's where he met many of the people in the painting that he asked in the painting, and that's where he met many of the members of the aristocracy whose portraits he painted. Okay. Now, I'm going to read a little bit more. Do you mind? Because you're kind of an art-oriented audience, I thought I'd read the first scene when he paints for the first time. He's got all these people, well, not all of them. You know, it was very difficult to get all 14 together every Sunday, so he had to juggle, and when you don't have all the people there, you're hampered as an artist because you don't know their colors. They're not in front of you. But he had, I think, he had 13 of them here at this time. And they had just gone boating and had this wonderful lunch, and he's sort of positioned them a little bit, but not much. He kept them kind of the way they were. And let's see. Stop, please. It was the moment. Do not move. But I'm looking down at my plate, Cécile Louise whined. You'll notice that that's a new name. I won't tell you why. Can't I look at Antonio? No, at Gustave. Can't I look at you? You know how I hate profiles. She gazed at him so adoringly, making a purring sound that he agreed, just so he could start. He liked the way Angèle was leaning toward Gustave, as if she were flirting, which she was, always was, with everyone, young or old, rich or poor, just for the pleasure of it. Auguste stepped into the scene and tipped Angèle's head more to the side. He lifted her chin and felt the bone under the skin. Touching the hollow behind it seemed an intimate thing. You said I wouldn't have to pose like a drunkard, Ellen said into her wine glass tipped up to her lips. You aren't. It's a coquettish gesture, ignoring a man gazing at you. Degas made me look lonely. Well, in that painting, Degas was presenting modern life as he saw it, Auguste said, being alone in a city of strangers. I have a different view, conviviality. So you don't need to worry. Can you see my face? Yes, through the glass, sparkling. A challenge to paint. He wasn't sure if any painter had attempted it since Vermeer. Was he a fool to try? My mother's going to have a fit, Ellen said. Stop complaining, doll face, Angèle said without moving. Think of the rest of us sitting here parched and dry all afternoon, dying, while wine is untouchable in front of us, and you can sneak little sips. Gustave was sitting too formally, considering his sleeveless singlet. Gustave, turn your chair around. Please. Gustave straddled it and leaned back. It would be a torturous position to hold without a back support. He wouldn't ask anyone else to do it. But Gustave knew instinctively what leaning back would convey. an instant of movement in time, the Impressionist ideal. God love him for offering that pose. Good, hold on to the chair to help you. Gustave pushed back his flat-top canotiere, his hat, rakishly, and held on. Perfect. Moving among them to make slight adjustments was an exquisite pleasure. By God, those jurists would stand in line to walk around in this painting, touch the women's cheeks, and sit down to join the party for a brandy. Light bathed the models and the table with warmth and brilliance. He admired each one and had to blink back his joy so it wouldn't spill over. I'll say one thing, and then let's be quiet for a while. You're all beautiful. Thank you for coming. I have the urge, Cecile Louise said. Here I am, Pierre said, flinging wide his arms. To go to the water closet. Angèle rolled her eyes. Squeeze it, princess. I'm sure you know. I'm sure you're an expert. People laughed, which changed the angle of some heads. How could he keep them all still? What had he gotten himself into? Some glorious insanity? He nodded to Fornez. Together they wheeled out the easel and clamped on the canvas, nearly 2 meters wide. Why did you need one so blasted big, Fornez said. Because it's going to make a big splash at the Salon. Because it's going to put to shame those monumental dead history paintings. This one will be live history. History in the making. What happens right here every Sunday on your terrace. He tried out several angles for the easel, settling on an orientation in line with the table edges. As he chalked everyone's position on the floor, he could feel a recognition deepening on them. The enormity of the project, the length of time it would take, the effort it would demand from all of them. Where to make the first stroke? Well, I'm going to stop right there. Where do you think he made it? Come on, we're among friends. Yes. The banister. That lady is absolutely right, at least from my imagination. We don't really know. There's no records. But it seemed to me, you're probably an artist. Why did you choose the banister?
Because it's solid. It's solid, and it will give the way people are leaning over towards it. It will give some perspective to the picture.
Yes, it gives a perspective. And you see, it's not quite in line with the table edges, so he had to fudge it a little bit. But he also said that it's all right to be irregular. So yes, it was the banister. He slashed a diagonal for the railing with the palest, most watery ultramarine and rose madder, diluted with linseed and turpentine. An upward stroke, awkward with his left hand. Bravo! Fornez shouted. Bravo! He laid down the awning supports as transparent as watercolors in case he didn't want them later. For now they were good guidelines. He took a clean brush for the lightest areas, the front table edge. He couldn't have the railing running parallel to the retreating table edge, and to achieve the foreshortened plunge, he'd have to fudge. There was nothing wrong with irregularity. Working foreground to background and left to right as usual felt awkward with his left hand. He set the lightest values, sunlight on Alphonse's back, Raoul's shirt collar, Gustave's singlet at his shoulder. An interesting gesture stroke. He wouldn't have done that with his right hand. He worked in a mite of chrome yellow for a creamier white across Alphonsine's back. She must be luxuriating in the sun's warmth along her spine, enjoying it like a cat. She was cat-like, adorable. The same tint on Maggiolo's jacket, Angèle's hat. Positioning the straw hats with pure chrome yellow, but still transparent. Pure joy to touch down here and there. He picked up vermilion and a pinch of ultramarine to tone it down, mixed them on the canvas for the chairs and Alphonse's beard, adding a tinge of Veronese green for Jules' jacket. Just flecks to build color harmonies. The browns, a trace of rose madder for Pierre's curly reddish beard like a poodle's coat, Raoul's jacket and bowler. So juicy it ran. The sheer magic of alchemy took his breath away, as if he'd never seen or performed it before. So, I mean, that just gives you an idea of how he started, not with one figure, but just setting the colors in little dabs all over. I thought you might be interested in that, but I have one more scene to read if you can stand it. It's quite different in tone. It takes place in the art supply shop where he bought the paint. Well, sort of bought the paint. It was owned by a man named Père Julien Tanguay. Père simply means father, a kind of an honorific term. Julien Tanguay, a real person. This, in fact, was painted of Tanguay by Van Gogh, who painted him a number of times. 10 years now after that devastating Franco-Prussian War and the siege of Paris, after which there was a French uprising because they were so angry with Napoleon III for starting the war, angry because it was started out of arrogance, a preemptive war that lasted longer than it was thought to have lasted at the outset. So there was this rebellion against the new government after Napoleon, and that was called the Commune. And it was put down by the government soldiers under the new government at Versailles, called the Versaillais. With draconian cruelty, killing 20,000 Parisians. They were part of this Communard uprising. Père Tanguay was one of the Communards, but when the Versaillais came and were, he was on sentry duty, and he threw down his musket and he raised his hand in surrender because he could not bring himself to kill another human being. So he was taken to prison, and it was the painters of Paris that petitioned to bring him out. He had helped so many of them whom he believed in, just the ones he believed in. So here is Tanguay's shop. After those, well, he'd been out for some time, but that experience gave him sad eyes and a soft heart. Renoir speaks. I see Cézanne sent you some new paintings. Julien pulled him deep into the narrow shop. Look at this one. Montagne Sainte-Victoire on a spring morning. Magnifique. Cézanne's a genius. How many of Sainte-Victoires do you have now? 4. One for each season of the year. Tanguay spread his arms wide. I have the best job in the world. How else could a poor man like me live with paintings like these? 7, Madame Tanguay said. The man's crazy. Who? Cézanne or Julien? Both of them. Grâce à Dieu, I only have to live with one of them. And a very fine man he is, Auguste said, winking at Julien. Tanguay gave a sharp nod to his wife, turned to Auguste and asked, what can I do for you today? This scene is actually before the previous one I just read. I need a roll of fine weave linen, primed, 190 centimeters of it. For one painting? Madame asked. That's nearly as tall as you are. True, he'd hardly believe what he just said. Well, that'll be the width. Tanguay took off his straw farmer's hat and scratched his head, motioning to the cast. How can you paint? I can paint. I'm ambidextrous. Madame huffed. Anyone who paints with his left hand is the devil's accomplice. What's your hurry? Why don't you wait till you get that thing off? The light, madame. In 2 months, the good light on the sun will be gone by 4 o'clock. Julian grinned with elfish pleasure that he knew enough to set a tube of cobalt blue on the counter and ask, "What other colors do you need?" "A far sight more than what I can pay for, I'm afraid." Name them." "Flake white, large." "That's 6 francs 50 already," Madame said. "Would you like 2 tubes?" Tanguy said. "One for now. Chrome yellow, vermilion, rose madder, Veronese green, emerald, ultramarine blue, large, and Prussian blue." "No, I will not sell you Prussian blue." "Julian, it's only a name. You don't have to prove your principles." "I spit on anything Prussian. Arrogant brutes commandeering Pissarro's house during the war, walking on his paintings so they wouldn't muddy their boots. Only 40 canvases saved of 1,500. And squeezing our national treasury for war reparations. Inhuman. No Prussian blue. To foreigners I sell it, to amateurs too. But I will not have Prussian blue in the Louvre. August chortled. "You're sure where it's going then?" "Bien sûr. You know what it's made of? Blood, flesh, bone black, soot. I will not have those disgusting things on your French painting. Use French ultramarine blue." "I will for some things, but I need that inky quality of Prussian blue for the canotier's dresses." "You've never had it in your palette before." "But I've never had that many canotier's dresses in my paintings before." "I need the finest grade, well washed, to keep it from fading." "No, c'est final." Tanguy picked the other tubes off the shelf. "These won't last for a painting that large. Come back when you need more." Tanguy said. Madame Tanguy blew out a breath. "Don't glop it on like Claude does, and you won't need so much." "What's the condition of your brushes?" Tanguy asked. "He likes his old ones," Madame said. "You can't paint a masterpiece with brushes worn down to the nubs," Julian said. "You need to start fresh, with no residual color. They won't feel like mine. You'll make them your own in no time. What do you need? Don't scrimp." "A filbert?" "Yes, in marten hair number 02, 2 hog's hair, wide and medium." "I give you the best, 2 Isabelles, made by Bretons, my countrymen." While Tanguy was getting them, Madame darted into the back room a moment, came out clutching something in her fist behind her shawl, and turned her back to wrap the tubes in newspaper and tie them with string. "If you can't pay, at least you can bring us a buyer for these Cézannes." Julian patted her arm. "Don't worry, Fione. The amateurs who disappear in 10 years, I make them pay up front." August placed 2 10-franc coins on the counter, only a fraction of the cost. Fione slapped her hand on top of them. "Thanks for trusting me for the rest, Julian. You have a big heart." "Ah, yes, he does," Madame said. "We're going to have roast trust for dinner tonight. And tomorrow night, brochette of heart à la communarde." All right, so I just tried to show you that the book is not all just about the painting. Each of these 7 models, who are my viewpoint characters, take you into their lives, backstage in the Folies Bergère, where there's a tragedy happening with Ellen's cellmate. They call the dressing room cells because they were underground. They take you to cabarets, to dance halls, to artist studios, to their own flats or to their mansions, whichever is the case. They take you to art galleries. They take you to parks, walks along the Seine. So you really get the vibrancy, the verve of life in the 1880s. So what questions do you have about this book or about me? And might we have some lights on, please? I'll go back to the painting. That's our friend Renoir. And now I have a portfolio of photos of Renoir during various stages of his life. It's outside. You'll have to turn the pages yourself. Okay, but let's see. I'm going to skip a few. Oops, that was Caillebotte. I wanted to show you him. But we'll get back to the painting itself. There. Questions? I was a high school teacher for 30 years. I know how to wait. You're correct. He went right to the canvas, which was amazing. No sketches. In oil or in charcoal or in pencil. Did he pay the people? Well, the women were professional models, except for Alphonsine. So he had to pay them. But the men were his friends, so I doubt if he paid them. He may have paid Alphonse, because he didn't know him perhaps as well. Yes? In his own words? No. I based my, that scene that I read about him starting this on 2 passages in a book written by his son, Jean Renoir, called Renoir, My Father.
Were there any flags that were the purpose of this picture, like I've heard once maybe that out the Barnes was also?
Oh, I'll tell you the Barnes story. Shortly after this painting was finished, it was purchased by the dealer Paul Durand-Ruel, who is a character later in the novel. And Durand-Ruel sold it immediately and then bought it right back and kept it for the rest of his life. He showed it never in the salon. But Paul Durand-Ruel was, by that time, representing all of the Impressionists. So it behooved him to show the best paintings by the Impressionists. And so he showed this in the 1888, the last Impressionist show. Renoir didn't want it shown with the Impressionists. He wanted it in the salon. But he didn't own it anymore, and so he had to acquiesce. Durand-Ruel showed it in London and in Vienna, in New York twice, and probably other cities in Europe. But he kept it in his dining room. And when the Phillips, Duncan and Marjorie Phillips, came to Paris to buy some art, Durand-Ruel invited them to his home for dinner, and they saw this painting and said that at whatever time he was ready to sell it, that they would want it. And so when he still didn't sell it at the time of his death, but his two sons wanted to expand the gallery, and so sold it to Duncan Phillips for $125,000. And they almost kind of had to be surreptitious about getting it out of France. It was well received eventually, yes, where in London and in other European capitals. That it's just that so large a piece and so representative of the period was. I'm sure the French would have wanted to have kept it then. The Louvre would have changed its tune, I would think. So it was not advertised that it was leaving France, but Duncan Phillips wrote to his treasurer, "People will come from all over the world to see this." And at one time he met Barnes, who was also a Renoir collector, who boasted to Renoir, "I have 34 Renoirs. How many do you have?" And Duncan Phillips said, "One. That's all I need. One is all I need. This one." What else? Yes. Yes. Ultimately, I had to consult about 100 books to write this book. But one important source was a catalog put out by the Phillips Collection called Impressionists on the Seine, celebrating Luncheon of the Boating Party. And it did the preliminary identification of those characters. And then I went from there to follow up with my own research. So I found out things that the Phillips Collection didn't know until I gave this same presentation to them. At that museum. I also, of course, did research in history and cultural history, in the music, the operas, the customs, the marriage laws, the marriage traditions, the changes, the beginning feminist movement, the levels of prostitution. That kind of features mildly in the book. Other things, too. Yes? I just read solidly for 6 months. And then when I couldn't stand it anymore, I started writing, or at least started to frame the book by making a kind of a list of scenes. That kept changing, and I added to it. And so the whole project took me about 3 years, but the research did not stop once I started writing. Continued to the very end. You had another question? I wish we could have more light so I could see. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. A great-grandfather who was a painter. When I was a little kid, I watched him paint. He had a studio in our backyard. It was my beginning. And my mother had a great color sense. When she taught me the color wheel when I was a little girl, she didn't just say red, orange, yellow, green, blue, or the primary, the tertiary, the secondary, the tertiary. She gave beautiful names. That's better. Isn't that better? She gave beautiful names to them, like ruby, amethyst, hyacinth, tangerine, emerald, and so that it sounded very exotic to me. I have never, I was not an art history major or minor. I have just loved so much to read about painters, painting movements, individual works, that, I just feed myself that way. I wrote Girl in Hyacinth Blue when I was under treatment for lymphoma, and reading about painting at that time really started me, because it was so uplifting to me. It took me out of my present situation and planted me in this world that I'm recreating for you today. And it was really quite a uplifting and a healing experience, those months I worked on that novel under those circumstances. Yes? That's really unknown. He broke his arm in that same year, but I searched and searched for information as to the month that he broke it. And because I couldn't find it, I only had him use his left hand for the first couple painting sessions, and then had him, if you read the book, I mean, he gets his cast off. But the fact that he broke his arm did happen twice. Yes? Both. Well, mostly stay up late, but it might be more interesting to you to tell you a little bit how I do my drafts. I start work on the computer with a scene, let's say, no, not longhand. And let's say I'm started with chapter 1. It may not end up being chapter 1, but it is just something to get me started. And that chapter may have a lot of holes in it, where I'm missing the connective material. Maybe I need to go back and do some more research, or just get a clearer sense of the novel. But when I can stitch those sections together into a whole, even though I know it's going to change a lot, then I go on and do the same thing with chapter 2. But when I finish chapter 2, filling the holes in it, I go back to chapter 1. And sometimes I move some material from 2 to 1, or vice versa. I see if they're working together, and then I add a third. And I work with chapters 2 and 3 together, just a minute. Then 3 and 4 together until this is a 40-chapter novel. When I get to 40 and I've filled those holes, or at least most of them, that's what I call chapter 1. I mean, draft 1, even though I've gone over each one maybe many times. Some chapters come more easily than others, and so I may have done maybe only 4 revisions. On others, maybe 8. So, but that's draft 1. And for this novel, and then after that, I go back to chapter 1 and work through it. And I worked through it, I did 11 drafts. My editor doesn't see it until draft 9. You mean in my notes? I had to index my notes. Yeah, and I had, those notebooks that you used in school that were a little shorter than, they were stitched together, composition books we used to call them. Well, because I was a teacher, I have a lot of those. And I think I had about 10 filled with notes. So in order for me to find something again, I had to read it over and catalog it. And yeah. Ross King is the author of, he's first known for Brunelleschi's Dome, but he wrote a book called The Judgment of Paris, which treated just the beginnings of Impressionism, and compared Manet with, what's that? Meissonier, who was the traditional painter. Yes, when I was stuck and didn't know something, I asked him, and he's done the same with me, so we have this nice relationship. He's in London, or in England anyway. Yes? honey, don't I wish I could say oui. No, I was there twice on research for this. One is never there long enough. Once was 10 days and the other was 2 weeks. Oh. Mm-hmm. Well, you've been a good audience. Now I want to tell you a couple things before I let you go. Do go on my website. There might be another book that you could discover there. And then if you lose track of who's who, and if you want to see any of these paintings again, they're all on my website. Even more are on my website. SusanVreeland.com. If you can't remember that, it is on the book. So if you take one with you today, you can know how to spell it. And the other is kind of a plea that is, we are all writers are a bit alarmed at the National Endowment of the Arts study of reading in America and the decline that has happened, and the demographic section of people with the greatest decline is surprisingly women, age 18 to 35. But I would love to have you get behind this campaign to turn that around. It's hard for me to believe when there's so many book clubs and new ones cropping up all the time that there is a decline in reading, but that's what NEA tells us. But what would happen if everyone that I spoke to for a year, I do 50 presentations a year, and what if everyone would do this? Find a person whom you suspect is not a reader. You may not know the person very much. Find out about that person enough to select a book especially for him or her as a gift. Don't give it at Christmas or a birthday. I want it to stand alone in that person's experience of receiving a book. And just since you're readers, you know what the right book at the right time can do for a life. Many people don't have that experience. So that's what I'm asking you to do.
How do you benefit from books on CD? Because I multitask driving, and I finished this checking it out library.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
I loved it. I loved the reader, and I would.
The reader for this book, you thought she did a good job?
Oh yeah, and right after I see your name, and I go, oh my gosh, I just finished that. I gotta hear this again. I was just like, I was there. It was
Good,
wonderful.
good. Yes, she does a good job.
Do you view that as like something supportive of the reading?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. Okay, but you can do books on tape or on CD just as well, and do it while you're doing something else. All right. Thank you so very much.